The year was 1885, and the Texas sun beat down on the town of Harrow County like a blacksmith's hammer on a raw iron anvil. It was a dry, unrelenting heat that baked the mud of the streets into cracked, pale ceramic and turned the air inside the wooden courthouse into a stifling, breathless weight. Dust motes hung suspended in the shafts of light that pierced the high, narrow windows of the courtroom, illuminating the packed gallery where the townspeople sat shoulder to shoulder, sweating and silent, waiting for the spectacle to begin. At the front of the room, standing entirely alone behind the heavy oak of the defense table, was 24-year-old Clara Boon. She wore a high-collared dress of dark, faded broadcloth, the fabric worn thin at the elbows from years of scrubbing floors and mending fences, and her posture was as rigid and unyielding as the wooden chair she refused to sit in. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, staring at the empty space on the polished wooden bench where the judge would soon sit, refusing to look at the faces in the gallery or the empty chair beside her. That chair was meant for Mr. Thomas Vance, the hired attorney from Austin who was supposed to be standing beside her today, defending the deed to the ranch her late father had built with his own 2 hands from the unforgiving Texas scrub. But Mr. Vance was not there. He was currently lying in a rented bed at the boarding house across the street, his jaw wired shut and his ribs heavily bandaged, having been beaten unconscious in the muddy alleyway behind the saloon the night before by 3 men whose faces he claimed he could not see in the dark. Clara knew exactly who had sent them, and she knew exactly why, just as she knew that standing here alone was tantamount to throwing herself to the wolves. But she was a Boon, and Boons did not surrender what was rightfully theirs without a fight. The heavy side door of the courtroom swung open, the iron hinges groaning in the quiet room, and Judge Arnold Crane strode to the bench, his black robes billowing around him like the wings of a scavenger bird, settling over a fresh kill. Judge Crane was a man who carried his power with a casual, sneering cruelty, a man who had spent a decade as the chief legal architect for the Meridian Railroad, smoothing the way for the tracks with a trail of broken contracts, stolen land, and ruined families before deciding that wearing a black robe in a county he essentially owned would be a more comfortable way to rule. He settled into his high-backed leather chair, steepled his fingers, and looked down at Clara with a smile that did not reach his cold, pale eyes. He waited. He let the silence stretch out, letting the heat and the weight of the room press down on her, letting the townspeople in the gallery murmur and shift in their seats, before he finally spoke, his voice carrying the smooth, oiled resonance of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He looked at her. "Miss Boon," he said, "I see you are without counsel this morning." "A tragic accident, I hear," befell Mr. Vance in the dark. Clara kept her hands resting flat on the table, her knuckles white, her voice steady and low when she replied. "It was no accident, Your Honor, and you know it." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a collective intake of breath at her audacity, but Judge Crane merely chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that echoed off the high wooden ceiling. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "I will forgive that outburst, Miss Boon, out of respect for your recent bereavement and your current, desperate situation. However, the law does not pause for personal misfortune. The Meridian Land Company has presented a signed deed bearing your late father's signature, transferring ownership of the Boon Ranch to their holdings. The signature has been notarized. The document is legally binding." "It is a forgery," Clara said, her voice ringing out clear and hard across the silent room. "My father never sold that land. He would have died before he gave it to the railroad." Judge Crane sighed, a theatrical display of patience wearing thin. "A bold claim, and one you currently have absolutely no proof to support, nor an attorney to argue. You are a young woman, Miss Boon, out of her depth and out of her mind with grief. You are standing in my courtroom, wasting the court's time, clinging to a patch of dirt you can no longer legally claim." He paused, letting his eyes sweep over the gallery, playing to the crowd, knowing they were watching his every move, before bringing his gaze back to her, his smile widening into something predatory and sharp. "But I am a fair man," Judge Crane continued, his voice dropping into a mocking conspiratorial tone. "I will make you a wager, Miss Boon, right here, in front of God and Harrow County. You have 48 hours to return to this courtroom with proof, actual, irrefutable, legal proof that this deed is a forgery. Win this case, prove me wrong, and I will take off these robes and resign my seat on this bench forever." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "But if you lose, as you surely will, you will not only forfeit the ranch, but you and your mother will pack your bags and leave Harrow County by sundown on Friday, never to return. A fair trade, wouldn't you say? Your exile for my resignation." Clara did not flinch, did not blink, did not let him see the cold terror gripping her chest, but simply nodded her head once, a sharp, decisive motion. "I accept your terms, Judge." In the back row of the gallery, leaning against the rough-hewn timber of the rear wall, a man named Eli Brooks watched the exchange with a stillness that bordered on the unnatural. Eli was 28 years old, a drifting cowboy who had ridden into Harrow County 3 days prior on a sweat-lathered roan gelding, his clothes layered with the pale dust of the trail and his face shadowed by the wide brim of a battered Stetson. He was a man who lived his life in the quiet spaces between towns, a former deputy from up in the Dakota Territory who had seen enough of the ugly side of the law to prefer the company of horses and the open sky to the complicated, deceitful affairs of men. But he was also a man who possessed a long memory, and he remembered a time many years ago when he was just a green boy learning to sit a saddle, riding drag on a cattle drive beside a tough, laughing, iron-willed man named Silas Boon. Silas had been her grandfather, a man who had taught Eli how to read a trail, how to calm a spooked horse, and how to stand his ground when the world tried to push him backward, and Eli owed the Boon family a debt that time and distance had never managed to erase. He watched Clara stand there, small and isolated in the vast, oppressive space of the courtroom, and he saw the exact same iron in her spine that he had seen in her grandfather's, the same refusal to bend, the same quiet, burning pride. He listened to the judge's mocking wager. He heard the smug, oily confidence in the man's voice, and Eli felt a slow, cold anger begin to uncoil in his chest, a familiar, steady tightening in his jaw that meant he was no longer just passing through. He waited until the judge slammed his gavel down, adjourning the court for 2 days, and he watched Clara turn and walk down the center aisle, her head held high, ignoring the stares and the whispers of the townspeople as she pushed through the heavy double doors and out into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. Eli followed her out, keeping his distance, watching the way she moved, the way she held her shoulders, the way a woman carrying the weight of the world still managed to keep her footing in the dust. He found her standing on the boardwalk outside the general store, staring sightlessly at a display of harness leather in the window, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the courtroom began to fade, leaving behind the cold reality of what she had just agreed to. He stepped up beside her, moving with the quiet, deliberate grace of a man who was used to sneaking up on wild things without spooking them. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to settle between them, allowing her to realize he was there before he slowly reached up and tipped the brim of his hat. "That was a dangerous bet you made in there, Miss Boon," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the noise of a passing wagon. Clara turned her head, her eyes sweeping over him, taking in the worn leather of his boots, the faded denim of his trousers, the low-slung holster tied to his right thigh, and the steady, unblinking calm in his dark eyes. She kept her chin up. "It was the only bet I had left to make." "My name is Eli Brooks," he said, offering the words simply, without embellishment. "I rode with your grandfather, Silas, a long time ago. He was a good man. He taught me things I haven't forgotten." Clara looked at him, searching his face, looking for the lie, looking for the angle. but all she saw was a quiet, solid certainty that she had not encountered since her father passed. "Silas is dead," she said softly. "I know," Eli replied. "And your father is gone now, too, and your lawyer is lying in a bed drinking broth through a straw. You are out of time and you are out of friends, Miss Boon, and that judge is planning to steal your life and laugh while he does it." He looked at her. "I am not a lawyer. I don't know the first thing about the inside of a courtroom, but I know how to find things that people want kept hidden, and I know how to stand in front of a door when someone tries to kick it in." A pause. "I would like to help you," he said. Clara stared at him, the noise of the street fading away, the heat of the sun pressing down on them, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a tiny, fragile fracture in the wall of isolation she had built around herself. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. She was not going to beg, but she saw the steady, quiet promise in his eyes, and she knew, with a sudden, absolute clarity, that this drifting cowboy was exactly what he appeared to be. "Where do we start, Mr. Brooks?" she asked. "We start with the paper," Eli said, turning to look back toward the courthouse, his eyes narrowing against the glare. "A man like Crane, a man who builds an empire on lies, he always leaves a paper trail. He can't help it. It's how he keeps score." They began their search at the county clerk's office, a cramped, dusty room piled high with leather-bound ledgers and stacks of yellowing paper, but the clerk, a nervous, sweating man who clearly feared the judge more than he feared God, refused to let them see the original deed, claiming it was locked in the judge's private chambers for safekeeping. Eli did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the clerk for a long, terrible moment, a look that promised a later reckoning, before turning and guiding Clara out into the street. "He's hiding the original because the ink will tell a story the copy won't," Eli said as they walked, his boots thudding softly against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. "We need to find a different angle. When exactly did your father pass, Clara?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it, spoken in his low, steady voice, sent a strange, unexpected warmth through her chest, a feeling of being anchored to something solid in the middle of a storm. "He died on the 14th of October, last year," she said, her voice tight with the memory. "It was a fever. It took him quick. And the date on the deed Crane presented today?" "The 16th of October," Clara said, stopping in the middle of the boardwalk, her eyes widening as the realization hit her. "The deed is dated 2 days after he died. My father could not have signed it." Eli nodded slowly. "Crane got sloppy. He forged the date after the fact, probably didn't bother to check the exact day your father passed. But we have to prove it. We have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt exactly when he died, and we can't rely on the town doctor because the doctor is in Crane's pocket." "The undertaker," Clara said, her voice breathless, her mind racing. "Mr. Higgins. He prepared the body. He keeps a ledger of every soul he tends to, the exact date and time. It's a point of pride with him." They found the undertaker's parlor at the far end of town, a narrow, gloomy building that smelled of formaldehyde, dried flowers, and old dust. Mr. Higgins was an elderly, stooped man with thick spectacles and hands that shook like autumn leaves, and when Clara explained what they needed, he looked terrified, his eyes darting toward the window as if expecting the judge's men to come crashing through the glass at any moment. "I cannot, Miss Boon," Higgins whispered, wringing his hands. "The judge, he is a powerful man. He knows everything that happens in this town. If he finds out I helped you, he will ruin me. He will take my business, my home." Eli stepped forward, moving smoothly between Clara and the old man, bringing the full, heavy weight of his presence to bear on the terrified undertaker. "Mr. Higgins," Eli said, his voice a low, soothing rumble, completely devoid of threat but thick with an immovable certainty. "Judge Crane is already ruining this town. He is stealing a ranch from a young woman whose father you buried. He is a thief in a black robe. He reached out and placed a large, calloused hand gently on the old man's trembling shoulder. I give you my word, as a man who has seen his share of hard days, that no harm will come to you. But we need that ledger. We need the truth. Higgins looked up into Eli's eyes, seeing the quiet, unyielding strength there, and after a long, agonizing moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and he turned and shuffled toward a heavy wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. He unlocked the cabinet, the key scraping loudly in the silence, and pulled out a thick, black-bound ledger, blowing a layer of gray dust from its cover before handing it to Eli. They opened the book on a small table near the window, carefully turning the brittle, yellowed pages, scanning the columns of names and dates written in the undertaker's meticulous, spidery script. Clara found it first. Her finger, trembling slightly, traced the line across the page. There. Silas Boon. Deceased, October 14th, 1884. Received for preparation at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She looked up at Eli, her eyes shining with a sudden, fierce hope. This is it. This proves the deed was signed 2 days after he was already dead. Eli looked at the page, his face impassive, his mind working through the angles, calculating the odds, and slowly he shook his head. It's a start, he said softly, closing the ledger. But it won't be enough. Clara felt the hope drain out of her, replaced by a cold, sharp frustration. Why not? It proves the forgery. It proves a discrepancy, Eli corrected, leaning against the table, his arms crossed over his chest. Crane will just say the date on the deed was a clerical error, a simple mistake made by a tired clerk. He will bring in 3 men who will swear on a stack of Bibles that they saw your father sign it on the 12th, and that the clerk just wrote down the 16th by mistake. He owns the court, Clara. He owns the witnesses. One ledger from a frightened undertaker won't bring down a man like Arnold Crane. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense, holding her gaze until the rest of the room seemed to fade away. If we want to break him, if we want to make sure he never touches your family or this town again, we have to cut the head off the snake. We have to find the ledger Crane keeps for himself. His private ledger? Clara whispered, understanding dawning on her. Exactly, Eli said. A man who runs a crooked operation like this, stealing land and taking bribes, he doesn't keep it in his head. He writes it down. He keeps a master record of every stolen deed, every paid-off deputy, every order from the railroad executives. He keeps it locked up tight, where he can look at it and admire his own cleverness. It will be in his office, Clara said, her voice steadying, the fear replaced by a cold, hard determination. Behind the courthouse. He has a private set of chambers there. There is a heavy iron safe in the corner. I saw it once when I was a girl, when my father went to pay his taxes. Eli nodded. Then that is where we are going. The night was thick and moonless, the air heavy with the smell of dry dirt and impending rain, when Eli and Clara made their way through the shadowed alleyways behind the courthouse. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth, their breathing shallow and controlled, moving with a synchronized, quiet competence that spoke of a deep, unspoken understanding between them. They reached the back door of the judge's chambers, a heavy oak panel set deep into the stone wall, and Eli knelt before the lock, pulling a small leather roll of thin steel tools from his pocket. He worked quickly, his hands steady and sure in the darkness, the metal pick sliding into the keyhole with barely a whisper of sound, his ear pressed against the wood, listening for the tiny, mechanical clicks of the tumblers falling into place. Clara stood behind him, keeping watch, her eyes scanning the dark alleyway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she did not panic. She did not speak. She simply trusted the broad, solid line of his shoulders and the steady rhythm of his breathing. A sharp click echoed in the quiet night, and the heavy door swung open on well-oiled hinges. They slipped inside, shutting the door behind them, plunging themselves into absolute darkness, before Eli struck a single match, the sudden flare of yellow light illuminating the opulent, wood-paneled room. It was a room built on stolen money, furnished with heavy mahogany desks, leather armchairs, and shelves lined with expensive gold-embossed law books, but their eyes were drawn immediately to the massive black iron safe sitting in the far corner, its brass dial gleaming dully in the matchlight. Eli approached the safe, dropping to one knee, handing the dying match to Clara and pulling a small metal stethoscope from his saddlebag. He placed the earpieces in his ears, pressed the bell of the stethoscope against the cold iron door right next to the dial, and closed his eyes, shutting out the room, shutting out the danger, focusing entirely on the hidden, internal mechanics of the lock. He began to turn the dial, incredibly slowly, his thick fingers moving with a delicate, precise grace, feeling for the microscopic drag of the tumblers, listening for the faint, metallic scrape of the pins dropping into the grooves. Clara stood beside him, holding a second lit match, watching the sweat bead on his forehead, watching the intense, singular focus in his face, and she realized, in that quiet, desperate moment, that she was no longer alone. She had spent the last year fighting a solitary, exhausting battle against a world that wanted to crush her, standing firm while everything she loved was stripped away. But looking at this man, this quiet, capable stranger who had stepped into the line of fire simply because it was the right thing to do, she felt the crushing weight of her isolation finally begin to crack. She watched the way he held his breath. She watched the way he moved. She watched the way a man who owed her nothing was risking everything to save her home. The safe gave a heavy, echoing clunk, the internal locking bar sliding back, and Eli reached up, grabbed the brass handle, and pulled the heavy iron door open. Inside, sitting alone on the top shelf, was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its edges reinforced with brass, its cover unmarked by any title or name. Eli pulled it out, resting it on his knee, and opened it, Clara leaning in close, the flame of the match dancing across the pages. It was a masterpiece of corruption, a meticulously detailed, handwritten account of a decade of theft and bribery, listing over 30 forged land deeds across 3 counties, the exact amounts paid to local sheriffs and clerks to look the other way, and, most damning of all, the direct written orders and financial transfers from the vice president of the Meridian Railroad Company, explicitly authorizing the seizure of the Boon Ranch and dozens of others. "He wrote it all down," Eli whispered, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. Every stolen acre, every dirty dollar. He was too arrogant to destroy the evidence. He thought he was untouchable. He looked up at Clara, the matchlight reflecting in his dark eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, the silence of the room wrapping around them, the danger of their situation completely forgotten in the shared, electric realization of what they had found. "We have him," Clara breathed, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We actually have him." Eli closed the ledger, the sound loud in the quiet room, and stood up, slipping the heavy book into his saddlebag. "Yes," he said, his voice low and steady. "We do. Now we just have to live long enough to show it to the town." The courtroom was packed to the rafters the following morning, the heat even more oppressive than before, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and nervous anticipation. Judge Arnold Crane sat high on his bench, his black robes immaculate, his face arranged in an expression of bored, weary patience, confident that the young woman standing before him was about to publicly surrender her home and her life. Clara stood at the defense table, wearing the same faded dress, her posture just as rigid, but there was a new light in her eyes, a cold, hard clarity that made the judge pause for a fraction of a second as he looked down at her. Eli sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind her, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on the judge, his presence a quiet, heavy anchor in the chaotic room. "Miss Boon," Judge Crane began, his voice rolling out over the silent crowd, "the 48 hours have expired. Have you brought the court the proof you promised? Or are you prepared to honor our wager, forfeit this property, and leave this county?" Clara did not speak immediately. She reached down, picked up the thick, black-bound ledger from the table, and held it up, the brass edges catching the light from the windows. "I have your proof, Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong, cutting through the heavy air like a silver blade. "I have the undertaker's sworn record, proving my father was dead 2 days before his signature miraculously appeared on your deed." She paused, letting the murmurs ripple through the gallery, before raising her voice, driving the words home. "And I have this," she continued, slamming the heavy ledger down onto the plaintiff's table with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Your private ledger, Judge Crane. The one you keep in the iron safe in your chambers." The color drained entirely from Judge Crane's face, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting in the heat, his hands gripping the edge of the bench so hard, his knuckles turned bone white. "That is stolen property," he choked out, his voice losing its smooth resonance, cracking with sudden, raw panic. "You broke into my chambers. I will have you arrested. I will have you hanged." "You will do nothing," Clara said, stepping away from the table, turning to face the gallery, turning to face the townspeople who had watched her family suffer. "This book contains the proof of 30 forged land deeds in this county alone. It contains the names of every man you have bribed, every official you have bought, and the direct orders from the Meridian Railroad paying you to steal our homes." The courtroom erupted. Men were shouting, women were gasping, the noise a sudden, deafening roar of anger and betrayal as the truth of the judge's corruption finally spilled out into the light. Judge Crane grabbed his gavel, slamming it down repeatedly, his face purple with rage, screaming for order, screaming for the bailiff to clear the room. But the bailiff, a man whose name was likely in that very ledger, stood frozen against the wall, refusing to move. And then, from the back of the courtroom, the heavy double doors swung open, and a man stepped inside, moving with a quiet, authoritative grace that instantly commanded the room. He wore a long duster coat, a silver star pinned to his chest, and he carried a lever-action rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. It was a federal marshal, summoned by a telegram Eli had sent the previous morning, a man who answered to Washington, not to the Meridian Railroad, and not to Judge Arnold Crane. The marshal walked slowly down the center aisle, the crowd parting before him like water, the noise dying down to a hushed, terrified silence until he reached the bench. He looked up at the sweating, trembling judge, his expression completely blank. "Arnold Crane," the marshal said, his voice a flat, unyielding drawl. "You are under arrest by order of the federal government for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Step down from the bench." Crane opened his mouth to speak, to argue, to threaten, but he looked out at the angry faces of the townspeople. He looked at the federal marshal, and finally, he looked at Clara Boon, standing tall and unbroken, and he realized that his empire was gone. He slowly stood up, his hands shaking, and stepped down from the bench, the black robes suddenly looking absurd and heavy on his defeated frame. The marshal clamped a pair of heavy iron cuffs around the judge's wrists, the metallic click echoing loudly in the silent room, and led him away, walking him down the aisle and out the doors, out of Harrow County forever. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment, the townspeople staring at the empty bench, trying to process the sudden violent shift in their world, before they slowly began to file out, their voices hushed, leaving Clara and Eli alone in the dusty, sunlit room. Clara stood at the table, her hands resting on the wood, feeling a strange, hollow exhaustion washing over her, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her feeling light and untethered. She turned and looked at Eli, who was still sitting in the front row, holding his hat, watching her with that same steady, quiet calm. He stood up, walked over to her, and stopped a few feet away, the space between them suddenly feeling charged and heavy with all the things they had not said. "It's over," he said softly. The ranch is yours. The town knows the truth. You won." Clara looked up at him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, the dust on his shoulders, the quiet strength that had held her up when she thought she was going to break, and she knew that the hardest part was not over, but was just beginning. "You said you were just passing through," she said, her voice barely a whisper, afraid of the answer, afraid that he was going to tip his hat and ride out of her life as suddenly as he had arrived. Eli looked at her, his dark eyes intense, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain, the confident, drifting cowboy suddenly struggling to find the right words. He looked down at his hat, turning it slowly in his hands, before looking back up, meeting her gaze squarely. "I have been riding a long time, Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "I have seen a lot of towns, and I have slept under a lot of stars, and I have never found a place that felt like it was worth stopping for." A pause. "Until now." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his presence a solid, comforting warmth in the cool room. "I am not a man of many words," Eli continued, his voice steadying, the uncertainty fading, replaced by a clear, honest declaration. "I don't have much to offer besides a strong back, a quiet nature, and a promise that I will never let anyone hurt you again. But I would like to stay, Clara. I would like to stay here on this ranch with you, as your husband, if you will have me." Clara stared at him, the breath catching in her throat, her heart hammering a sudden, joyful rhythm against her ribs, and she realized that this was not a grand, poetic romance. This was not a fairy tale. This was just a good, solid man offering her a partnership built on respect, on shared quiet, and on a deep, unspoken understanding. She looked at him, a slow, beautiful smile breaking across her face, lighting up her eyes, and she reached out, taking his rough, calloused hand in hers. "It took you long enough to ask, Mr. Brooks," she said softly. They were married 3 weeks later, in a simple, quiet ceremony on the front porch of the ranch house, standing under the wide Texas sky, surrounded by a few close friends in the vast, beautiful expanse of the land they had fought so hard to keep. The years rolled by, the seasons turning the green grass to gold and back again, the harsh winters giving way to the blazing heat of the summers, and the Boon Ranch prospered, the fences mended, the cattle fat, the house filled with the sounds of life and laughter. 10 years later, on a cool autumn evening, Clara sat on the front porch, a thick woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Eli sat in a rocking chair beside her, his hair touched with gray at the temples, his face lined with the sun and the wind, his hands busy oiling a piece of harness leather, moving with the same quiet, deliberate grace he always had. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, with his mother's bright eyes and his father's quiet, serious demeanor, sat on the steps at their feet, whittling a piece of soft pine with a small pocket knife. "You know," Clara said, leaning back in her chair, a gentle, teasing smile on her lips, "I was thinking about the day we met, outside the general store. You were so quiet, I thought you might have forgotten how to speak entirely." Eli paused in his work, looking over at her, a slow, warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I hadn't forgotten," he said, his voice a low, familiar rumble. "I was just waiting for something worth saying." He reached out, his rough hand covering hers, the warmth of his touch a steady, constant presence in her life, a silent reaffirmation of the promise he had made in that dusty courtroom 10 years ago. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard, watching the stars begin to prick through the fading light. Two people who had found their anchor in each other, a testament to the quiet strength of endurance, the power of unspoken gestures, and the profound, transformative nature of a love built on a foundation of absolute trust. That is the true nature of a quiet life, the slow, deliberate building of something lasting out of the wreckage of hardship, the understanding that the most profound declarations are often not spoken in grand speeches, but are demonstrated in the daily, unglamorous acts of showing up, of standing firm, and of choosing to stay when the rest of the world tells you to run. It is the realization that true strength is not found in the volume of your voice, but in the unwavering certainty of your actions, in the willingness to look at a broken world and decide to build something beautiful in its place, hand in rough, calloused hand, one quiet day at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey today, for walking the dusty streets of Harrow County and witnessing the quiet courage of a woman who refused to break and the steady resolve of a man who chose to stay. I am grateful you were here to share this story of resilience, of justice, and of the enduring power of a plain-spoken truth. Until next time, keep riding.